Hi, I'm James and welcome to the first of a series of videos about the Twilight 2000 role-playing game, 4th edition, published by Free League. Now at the minute it's only available to those who backed the Kickstarter. The alpha version is now out, so what I'm basing on are the comments from the alpha version. It is possible that the final published version may be slightly different. This video I'm going to look at the background to the game, which is substantially different to the previous editions. I'm going to go through the background and I'm going to give a few thoughts on what I think to it and some explanations of possible things that have gone off. So let's have a look what it says in the background. So in 1989 the Berlin Wall falls. That's exactly as it is in real life history. In 1990 Iraq invades Kuwait, starting the Gulf War, and Germany reunited. Again, those are exactly as happened in the history. Then in 1991 Yeltsin was elected the president of Russia. Note that's Russia, not the Soviet Union. Gorbachev remained the leader of the Soviet Union. And technically the Warsaw Pact was dissolved on the 3rd of July, although the command structure didn't really change. So this is still as per the background. We then come to the August coup. Now this was a major event in real life, but this is where we have the first subtle difference. The Gang of Eight, with the KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev, started the coup. Gorbachev was arrested, and it was announced that he was ill and resting. That was announced by the vice president, actually interestingly the only elected one in Soviet history, Gennady Yanayev, who was also one of the 8. So Yeltsin, it says, was arrested. That's the way they've done it. I like the slight variation that I used in the second edition of the background, where what actually happened was the order to storm the White House, which is the Russian Parliament, was given, and in real life the leader of the KGB Alpha group, who was tasked with it, said no and resigned on the spot, and his deputy did the same, and that's what caused the real life August coup to crash and burn. What I did in mine was I gave a nod to it by having the chief resign, but I had the deputy go okay and storm it. So you could make a little change there. It'll make absolutely no difference to the background there. It does note that the Gang of Eight are less successful, particularly in the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, where Soviet troops occupy the strategic buildings like TV towers, but there are violent protests. So this is still quite reasonable. It says strong condemnation by the US, the Soviet forces retreat. Yeah, I can live with that being acceptable. That's quite logical in some ways. It's a chance for the US to sort of show that they've done something. After that, the 3 Baltic states declare independence and immediately apply for NATO membership. Okay, yeah, that's reasonable. So moving to 1992. Now, it reckons that the Soviet Union collapse could be halted by the 8. Okay, I can live with that. They spend a lot of time purging inside the Soviet government. Economic liberalisation is introduced a little. Freedom of the press and other liberties revoked step by step. Again, that's perfectly reasonable. The US then, as predictably, as the US often does, goes to domestic politics, and as in real life, George Bush loses re-election and is replaced by Bill Clinton. So we're still very reasonable. 1993, Clinton, who was never a strong leader in real life, tries to show solidarity with the former Warsaw Pact, visits Poland and the Baltics, signals they can count on NATO's support and eventually membership. Soviets protest, yeah, that makes sense, but the former superpower's on its knees, yeah, again, reasonable. Oslo Agreement, as in real life, is signed between Israel and the Palestinians. So yeah, we're not moving radically away from history yet. 1994, now Yanayev at this point dies under mysterious circumstances, and the KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev becomes the new president of the Soviet Union. Not unreasonable. In reality, Yanayev was very much the figurehead, and the power behind the scenes was Khrushchev. I would assume that gradually the other members of the Eight are dwindled down until he is very much in sole charge. And with rising oil prices, the Soviet Union gets back to its feet. Okay, yeah. 1995, Khrushchev holds a speech about the illegal exit from the Soviet Union by the Baltics. Yeah, and claims it was a CIA plot. Clinton administration sees the speech as empty rhetoric, doesn't respond. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. It's the sort of speech he'd probably be making for internal consumption. 1996 then. So on May the 9th, Soviet tanks thunder into Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania as Khrushchev tries to bring them back into the Soviet influence. He says during a speech that he's protecting Russian minorities and to restore the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. Yeah, when you view that as a Russian perspective, that's pretty reasonable. The Russians have always seen the suffering they had in the Second World War as something they never wanted to repeat, understandably. So what they have done is generally try and keep a buffer state between them and the West. It's worth remembering that in real life, Khrushchev was actually a senior member of the KGB during 1983, during the Able Archer incident, when the Russians actually thought a nuclear attack on them was likely, and potentially even a ground war, and he was highly involved as one of the people who believed that was happening. Was quite vocal. It was all part of a NATO attack. So the paranoia is quite reasonable. The US reaction is very muted. That's basically very much they can do. By the time they're in a position to do anything, it's too late. Witness similar things that have happened in real life in places like the Crimea. So it's not particularly unreasonable. The Russians only take a week to actually secure the countries. Again, definitely not enough time to do much. Attempts are made in the UN to condemn it and make them withdraw, but the UN, as in real life, with one of the Security Council members being the Soviet Union having the veto, nothing can be done. It's vetoed. Guerrilla warfare does carry on. Now, with this happening in the middle of the US primaries, it does have an impact on what happens in real life. You have Harvey West, who's a former Lieutenant General of the Marine Corps, unexpectedly defeats Bob Dole in the Republican primaries. Now, I get a distinct feeling that this is based on Oliver North. We even have the same service, so it's a very subtle nod, in a very similar way to the character in the film Lord of War. So he becomes the Republican nomination, and he then beats Bill Clinton, citing the weakness against the Russians. Yeah, so that makes sense. Moving on to 1997 then, Harvey West becomes president and starts fulfilling his campaign promises. He beefs up the forces in Germany and Norway. Yeah, it says even using tactical nuclear weapons deployment. Newly commissioned USS Harry S. Truman sails into the Baltic, trying to basically do gunboat diplomacy by the sound of it. Khrushchev sees this as an existential threat. Yeah, we see the comments from the previous year for that one. He is concerned with Poland becoming part of NATO. That is the buffer gone, and then a surprise attack would be straight into the Soviet heartland. So, as a result, Soviet troops cross the border into Poland, basically using the excuse yet again of protecting the Russian minority. And it says it's en masse. West reacts with force. Now, I like there's a little touch here. He doesn't want to send in ground forces. Now, for somebody who lived through that era, that was highly realistic. NATO, particularly American forces, are very resistant to casualties. It's very much a case of bad PR, body bags coming home. Witness what happened in Somalia on the day of the Rangers, with Black Hawk Down. That's a prime example. So the NATO forces respond by airstrikes. Okay, that does make sense. The Russians, however, respond. They're using airstrikes again, and this time they're hitting not just places in Poland, but also, it says, US military bases in the United Kingdom, Germany, Turkey, Italy, Norway and Iceland. Iceland being an interesting one. It doesn't seem obvious, and it does seem to be expanding the war. I can't quite work out why. I'm assuming this is sort of very much trying to deal with the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap in a similar way to Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising. But there's no land invasion, it is just airstrikes. As the Soviets closing in on the Oder River, which is the border with the reunited Germany, pressure mounts for President West and the NATO allies, and it's decided to launch a multinational ground operation in Poland to break the Soviet advance. Again, that's not something that would be automatic. I think it's something that would be a very difficult decision. I can see it going either way, but it's not outside the bounds of possibility. West, though, goes a bit further than that. He wants to stop it all across Europe, and he draws a line, it says, from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean. US troops sent to the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, who all happily receive them. So we are giving the NATO forces a lot of extra options when you come to building your forces, because we can start including all the former Warsaw Pact countries quite happily. From a gaming perspective, kind of makes my life a bit easier. The US military also activates the reserve component, pulling in the Army, Air Force and Naval reserves. Yeah, that's making sense. In 6th of June we get the first fighting just west of Poznan. After that, the Soviets now cross the border into Romania and Slovakia. Yeah, it's not unreasonable. I can see that happening quite nicely. So at sea we've got the USS Harry S. Truman and the supporting units fighting with the Soviet Baltic Fleet out of Kaliningrad. Now, interesting little bit, bearing in mind that Free League are Sweden, they've brought Sweden into the game, which was something that was really missing in the first edition. There was only the Scandinavian supplement that was unfortunately not written in English, so I've never been able to get access to that. The US asked Sweden to allow US troops and aircraft to be located on Gotland in the middle of the Baltic. This is denied by the Swedes, sticking to their neutrality. It does lead to a very violent debate in Sweden, and it does work quite nicely. I can see that happening. President West refuses to back down and sends a marine force into Gotland. Swedish armed forces deploy. There is brief fighting, both, it says, in air and a naval battle, and eventually Sweden agrees to a ceasefire. US troops land on Gotland, Stockholm and in Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden, securing the supply lines. One of the few times we actually see logistics referred to, which is quite nice. Again, there is a big debate in the country about this ceasefire. The left accuses the government of making secret deals with the US, which I think is potentially an option. I keep thinking for that one of the Finnish forces fighting mock battles with the Germans when Finland changed sides during World War II. In Moscow, the Kremlin now sees Sweden as effectively a member of NATO and thus a hostile country. I think that fits Khrushchev's personality quite well. And he decides to do something about this. The Soviet Air Force starts attacking, tanks rumble, it says, into northern Finland, advanced towards the Swedish border to the far north, large airborne forces landing near Stockholm, and Soviet ships enter the Stockholm archipelago. There is a lot more detail on this in the section on Sweden, which does give a lot more detail, except for a country we've never really seen in Twilight 2000 before. There's a few weeks of heavy fighting until basically both sides get fought to a standstill. It's sort of the country is split between them. The Harry S. Truman is badly damaged and limps into Stockholm. The Baltic Sea is now very much a Soviet lake. Getting throughout Europe, US technological advantages, it says, and more numerous Soviet forces. Tends to favour the more numerous ones, so there are Soviet advances in Poland, Romania and Slovakia. Now this is the bit, as a Brit, that I did find interesting. The Soviet Northern Fleet then sails south to attack the US supply lines across the Atlantic. Yeah, I fully follow that the Atlantic air and sea bridge is going to be one of the most vital aspects of a battle there. And it says to prevent UK troops assisting the US in the Baltic. Okay, and we now have the Royal Navy fighting the Soviets. It doesn't mention a lot about the naval forces other than that, but the Soviet submarine fleet isn't mentioned a lot. Now I'll come back to that shortly, because I think there is a very good link in there. I do think that as well that some of the reviews have actually underestimated how strong some of the Soviet fleets would be, because we tend to think of them all being mothballed. They weren't massively strong, but they did have a significant force. And amusingly, in real life, at one point, by selling them for scrap metal, Pepsi became one of the largest naval powers on the globe. Just find that one as a lovely bit of trivia. So, 1998. Well, the year starts badly for the West. Syria, under Assad, launches an invasion of Jordan. I can't understand really why that occurs. There doesn't seem to be any logical reason for it. I think it's simply because Jordan was a Western ally and Syria was backed, and obviously in real life still is, by the Russians. Once this has occurred, the Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, decides to create a new united Arab Republic, uniting with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now, this I find very unrealistic. It was tried in real life previously as the UAR, the United Arab Republic, hence the name, the new United Arab Republic. It suffers a big problem, as it did in real life, in that there can only be one leader. And if you consider you've got Assad and Saddam Hussein, neither of them is likely to give in to the other. So if we view it as a loose confederation as opposed to a united force, I think we might get a better feel for what would happen in the history. So the NUAR rejects the Oslo Agreement and demands Israel abandons the West Bank, Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. Israel refuses. Syria and Iraq, interestingly supported by the Soviet Air Force and Navy, attack the Golan Heights. I am quite bemused at how the Soviet Navy attacks the Golan Heights, considering it's on the border with Syria and far inland. I'm assuming just naval support there. And into the Jordan Valley. Israel fights back, but they are struggling. Okay, if we have Soviet support in there, I can see that as likely. If we flash back to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel is very much kept going by the use of US supplies, which wouldn't soon be available in this. They're more likely to be prioritised into Europe. So yeah, I can see them falling back. West under pressure, as it says there, draws the conclusion, it hesitates, and the Israelis draw the conclusion that the US has abandoned them, at which point they switch to tactical nuclear strikes. For some reason I'm getting flashbacks to the sum of all fears here. With that then does halt the invasion. Syria asks Moscow to retaliate with nuclear weapons, not having a program of its own. But the Russians decide, no, this is probably going to be a bad plan, so they refuse. In Washington, West fears the Soviet manpower advantage will overrun Central Europe. He activates a selective service draft, which, okay, that makes sense. So we now have the US introducing conscription. It says reaction ranges from patriotic enlistments to willful disobedience. Okay, that makes sense. Vast amounts of training are going off, but it's going to take until the end of the year to actually produce 500,000 soldiers that could be used to reinforce Europe. Okay, yeah, the lead-in time for that is quite high. The concept of the difficulty with getting the draft, yeah, that follows. I think with this one we're unlikely to get people going to Canada as we did for the Vietnam War, simply because Canada, being a member of NATO, is presumably involved in the fighting in Europe, although I've seen nothing that actually says that in the background. So with NATO having all these soldiers on the way, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Unfortunately, however, it turns out to be a spark, because until those troops arrive, something has to be done to stop the Soviets, and West decides to use tactical nuclear weapons, based on the fact that the Israelis had used them and presumably hit Soviet units, and there had been no retaliation. Okay, yeah, not the brightest of options, but definitely not outside the bounds of possibility. So, first of all, nuclear strikes occur in Poland, later Sweden and elsewhere. This does stop the Soviets. Unfortunately for them, the Russians are outraged by this, and we then have the nuclear weapons being used tactically by both sides. Just like in the previous editions of the game, it starts off gradually with hitting command and control. It then escalates to start hitting broader military units. It then starts hitting industrial centres and civilian targets, expanding from continental Europe into the United Kingdom, the US and Russian heartlands. EMP, as in the previous editions, is very effective, more than was predicted, and a lot of electronic communications are affected. Computers would be affected badly, which is going to help with the breakdown later on. Civil order obviously is starting to break down at this point. Back in the US, there's now massive civil unrest. It says huge marches in the streets with hundreds of thousands of people. The rift grows, leading to violence. Street fights start breaking out in cities. Both sides organise militias. Some large cities, local police join the demonstrations. Fighting erupts between police and federal forces. Some US states openly denounce the president's rule. Okay, yeah, it's basically looking at the worst that happened, I would say, during the 60s and 70s, and then upping it by an order of magnitude. It's not unrealistic, given what is going off in the background. It does say as well, a few federal agencies such as the State Department and the CIA are rumoured to be secretly helping the rebels. I like the word rumoured. I think it's very unlikely in background terms, but we only need to look at the present day to look at how misinformation very quickly spreads. Okay, we wouldn't have as much social media in this point, but with the communication issues and everything going off, rumours are probably going to be easier to spread than real news. So yeah, that's achievable. Kremlin now regarding the US as weakened. initiates a major offensive to end the war once and for all. That phrase will get used an awful lot as you go through the background. What the Russians do is, rather than attacking directly head-on into Poland, go for flanking through the Czech Republic and into southern Germany, quickly taking Dresden, Leipzig and Nuremberg before another wave of nuclear strikes hits them. Yeah, that's not unreasonable. The Soviets also move further into Norway and reach the Atlantic coast, supported by naval forces. I'm assuming that the Northern Fleet and the Baltic Fleet are available for that. And at this point as well, this is where a lot of my questions when I started working on Twilight 2000 4th edition came in. The Soviets then used the Northern Fleet to take out the Royal Navy, supported by the French. That's the British supported by the French. I know cynics from previous editions might say that's on the other side. But then they actually stage a landing in Britain. Now, I have tried to work out the logic for this. It doesn't really seem to make much sense until you consider that we have the big air and sea bridge across the Atlantic. Now, if we assume that the Soviets left their submarines at home at the start of the war, not unreasonable, because getting those would be a really obvious sign that they were preparing for war. It's used that way in Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy, and there's also references to it in The Hunt for Red October, again by Clancy. They are giving a big clue that they're going to go to war. So we'll assume that the Navy has been predominantly bottled up. Now, to start affecting the convoys, they need to deal with the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap and the SOSUS line. If they can take Britain out of the war, that creates a massive gap. It gets the submarines through to play havoc with the fleets crossing the Atlantic. Not only that, you can also use then the Air Force using Britain as, it used to be called America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, using it as a Soviet one instead. So there is the possibility for that to occur. It does strike me that there would probably be a lot more British troops still left in Britain than the game suggests. There is only reference to one Soviet division, which seems very limited. Even an air assault division skipping around in helicopters is going to struggle to hold anything. So that's something I'm not so sure on. I like some of the concepts with it. It gives me a very different Britain from previous editions. But it does introduce a few questions. Given a larger Soviet force, I can see that happening. But it still leaves the issue of logistics. Logistics is the big problem with this. So how would they be resupplied? It's possible, but I think that's possibly something I'm going to have to dig and modify slightly in my background. So British troops are struggling. There are the American Legion, which is basically made up of troops that are in the UK. It talks about convalescing troops. I would also add in the troops from the air bases and from ships that have sunk. So you have a reasonable US force to add to it. From a gaming perspective, Soviet Air Mobile versus British, probably Home Defence Force, so Home Service Force troops, plus Americans. Yeah, that's not a bad wargaming situation. So I've got a decent little background there. It doesn't go according to plan. The Russians do launch an attack in London. There's a reference to the charge of the Trafalgar Square Martyrs, which sounds as if they are the Home Service Force troops. I don't see that as a full invasion force going into London, but perhaps dealing with a raid. And it does refer to it as very much the Tet offensive of the fighting in Britain. It's not a military success for the British, but it does have such an effect on the Soviets that they now struggle. So they basically pull back into enclaves, and you now have the British, the Americans and the Russians scattered. The bad news from the British perspective is Queen Elizabeth II is rumoured to be killed. I like the way they use rumoured quite a few times in this. It really does come in as a useful little touch. So at this point we now have the reinforcements starting to come over the Atlantic. The Soviets do try and hit these. It says there's a huge war at sea and in the air going on for weeks. By the end of it, the Soviet Navy's been obliterated, which is going to further limit any resupply into Britain. But they have impacted on the US troops coming over. This and all the strikes, nuclear strikes, hit the point now where the Americans would be incapable of evacuating the troops from Europe, it notes. So, into 1999. It says the winter's the coldest in living memory, and by New Year's Eve, civilian losses pass 15% in more cities on the continent. I would actually regard that as optimistic. I would suggest that probably would be much higher. Communication and transport breaks down, food supply chain collapses. Again, I'd say that's probably going to happen earlier than that. There's not that much of a resupply of food in, particularly in Britain, so I can see that be quite concerned. It talks about Africa and South America. While they've been largely spared from the war, they've been hit hard as the trade collapses. So economically, you're going to get problems. International shipping has gone, and fuel prices skyrocketing. Come the spring, disease then starts hitting, and it picks some examples of things like typhoid fever, cholera, bubonic plague, host of other diseases, starting in Europe, spreading across the world. By the end of the year, world population is now down to 50%. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It says now fighting in Europe is down to survive rather than to conquer. Front lines have largely disappeared, replaced by large occupied areas. This is very familiar to anybody who came up on the first and second editions. Tanks start breaking down, supply of spare parts gradually dwindles to zero. I'd have actually had that probably slightly earlier, but it's definitely going to be hitting in now. Sophisticated artillery ammunition is gone, and there's no one capable of producing any more. Yeah, that makes sense. They're saying divisions started the war with 20,000 troops, now lucky to put 2,000 into the field. When you think of the impact of that, that is absolutely massive. Most of the casualties will have been in frontline troops. The bulk of the survivors would be rear echelon. They're now going to be moved more and more forward into the front lines. So we are going to find troop quality at this point is going to take a bit of a nosedive. Supply lines have basically ceased to function, and troops are living off the land to survive. As it's crumbling, local militias start forming. Some of these cooperate with NATO, some with the Soviets, and some fight everyone. Okay, that sort of makes sense. It talks about the most efficient of these are the Red Brigades, which are taking direct orders from the Soviet military command. Okay, yeah, possibly taking orders direct from the military command is being a bit optimistic, but yeah. In the US then, conflict then, both at home and overseas, erodes the authority of the government. Several states effectively declare independence. Even states making no such official declaration choose to ignore Washington from this time on. So America is breaking down. That's realistic. I think that fits in nicely. There are the odd little nods it puts in the background, particularly when you look upon the CIA and DIA, where it does hint at the division between the military and the civil government. You don't get the situation from the previous editions with President Tanner and open war between Milgov and Civgov, but there's enough hints for you to take it that way if you wanted. Instead, America is much more descending into anarchy and lots of regional and local governments. probably thinking sort of a good example of this would be to go and look at The Postman by David Brin. So, the year 2000 then. The dawn of a new millennium, it says. Well, technically that was 2001, but that's just being picky. It says civil rule has basically stopped existing through most of Europe. It's the military now who are running everything, simply because they're the ones with the capacity to defend themselves and survive. And it talks about units recruiting civilians into the ranks. Okay, yeah, that's not unreasonable. We can look at some good precedents for that, where you get more and more supporting elements being used until you hit the point where they are actually replacing the rear echelon troops, which again are being probably pushed forward into frontline elements. So yeah, that makes sense. So April, word starts to trickle down. American troops in Northern Europe start talking about rumours about Operation Reset. First major offensive in over a year. It says the plan is to try and link up the scattered remains of NATO troops in Sweden and Poland, make a massive push to seize the two besieged capitals of Warsaw and Stockholm. And the main purpose of this push, other than to take these, is unknown. Now there are lots and lots and lots of hints that reset is going to be a major thing. In the original game, Operation Reset was used in Free City of Krakow. It was a set of documents that basically told you how to make a computer that was more effective and would actually run on quite simple things. I know over the years that's been revised. I know I've heard suggestions that it becomes an operating system that's much more agnostic of the technology it's running on. There are lots of things. In this, Reset is left very, very unclear. I did make a joking suggestion that perhaps it's actually a search for Bruce Morrow of the Morrow Project. It could be anything, and I think Free League will actually eventually say what it is, but in the meantime a lot of GMs are going to be able to go, oh, I'm going to make it that, and there's nothing wrong with that. It starts out well. It takes the Soviets by surprise. In the days when we're now talking no sort of air recon or satellite, that's definitely easier, and it starts to succeed. But there is then the flip side, where the NATO forces have the same problem. They don't realise how strong the Soviets are, and a massive Soviet counterattack hammers into, as we all know, the 5th Division at Lodz, which is absolutely mauled, ending with the instruction, good luck, you're on your own. The background does imply that it's far more than the 5th Division that's slaughtered. It's the entire assault by NATO. So you're actually talking, I believe it's 8 corps altogether. Now, for them to be fully shattered, I think is probably unrealistic. I'm going to put that one down to its exaggeration, its rumour. The 5th Division's been hit, some of the other divisions have been hit, and there is probably more intact than people think. Bearing in mind the smaller size of units again, the way the rumour mill works in Twilight 2000, it's very likely players will get the wrong impression, and to be perfectly honest, there's nothing wrong with having the information which I've taken from the player's guide there be incorrect. There's no reason that can't be the case, and the GM then gets more information. So that's the background for Twilight 2000 by Free League. I do quite like it. I do have the odd doubt. I know there have been some major issues on the website. A lot of people have been unhappy with it because it's broken with the previous versions. I think if you look back at the previous versions, they were all produced well before social media was a thing, with the end result that, yeah, there probably was criticism. I mean, I remember the absolutely negative opinion of the original game in White Dwarf when it was reviewed. But it's a game at the end of the day. Is it unrealistic? It has elements that I don't think are that likely. The only problem is I could say exactly the same about real life. I'll be interested to see where they take the game, what other information they add to it, what other details they give. There are some massive gaps. China hasn't been mentioned at all. I do miss the Sino-Russian War. That would have been a really nice thing. Having said that, the absence of that does give you enough Soviet troops to try and take Poland. So there is a bit of a swing and roundabout aspect to that. There's no mention of Southeast Asia and going down to Australia. There'll be a lot of debate, no doubt, with that, particularly from the people down that way. I'll be interested to see what occurs there. There's nothing on Africa, very limited information on the Middle East, and nothing in South America. So there are lots of things that will probably be expanded on. And I can't wait to see it. I'm going to move on now to actually start looking at the rules and the equipment and so on, and I'll add some more of those in future videos. Hopefully I'll see you soon.